now happy to introduce Cheryl Kwok, who is a student at King's College London, and she has prepared a very interesting presentation as well. And I'll just let her introduce herself a little bit and then dive into the presentation. Thank you, Cheryl, if you want to take over.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you, Andrea. So hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And thank you very much for joining me today. It's very lovely to see all of you. So what I'm going to do, well, my name is Cheryl Kwok, and I'm a postgraduate student on the MA in Education and Arts and Cultural Settings program at King's College London. So the topic I'm going to focus on today is called Rethink, Reskill, Reboot, which is quite vague. But you'll see why I've done. I've titled this presentation as so in a minute. But the topics that I'm going to primarily be looking at today are I'm going to be discussing issues surrounding the cultural economy, so particularly focusing on the job market in the arts, and I'm also going to be looking at what arts education is doing to address these issues. And finally, I'm going to suggest some solutions of my own as to how we can better deal with these sort of very relevant topics that, you know, have become especially relevant during COVID-19. So I'm also going to be incorporating some sort of ethnographical accounts based on my own experiences as a young creative trying to find a job in the arts industries, and I'm going to combine that with various other stories from friends as well. So hopefully it'll be a little more interesting and a little more engaging than just me, you know, throwing statistics at you. And lastly, just to say that I very much welcome discussion. So I'll try to leave some time at the end to I'll try to leave some time at the end of the presentation so that we can just have a little bit of a discussion. But if you've got any burning questions or comments, please feel free to leave them in the chat. And Andrea or Augustina will be able to relay that to me afterwards. All right, without further ado, let's start. So, first of all, I want you to have a bit of a look at this infographic. Now, if you're based in the UK, this infographic will be quite familiar to you. It was released in October 2020 by a government division called Cyber First here in the UK. This is a campaign which helps young people get into tech by introducing them to the fast-paced world of cybersecurity. So I'm going to sort of just highlight a few key points that I picked up from this infographic. So number one, we have this non-white girl whose name is Fatima. She's a dancer. Her next job could, and as the infographic suggests, it should be in cyber. So it says Fatima's next job could be in cyber, but she just doesn't know it yet. And so I think in terms of, you know, what I've gotten out of this infographic, this particularly highlights the difference in how tech or the sciences versus the arts are perceived in terms of job stability and sustainability. So clearly, you know, tech and the sciences are profitable and a good career to get into, whereas the arts aren't. And it's just that Fatima doesn't know that yet. And so I also want to draw your attention to the bottom left of the infographic, which says Rethink, Reskill, and Reboot. Now, this might be a bit familiar, but in this particular case, in the case of the infographic, we can see that, you know, rethink, you know, we should rethink a career in the arts. Reskill, well, we should reskill today's artists so that they go on to more profitable or more developed industries such as tech and the sciences, and to ultimately reboot, again, a term we used in sort of computer language, which means that, you know, Fatima herself should be rebooting and becoming sort of a science person who works in tech or science. Now, just keep these three words in mind, because that's basically what I've structured my presentation on. And so just to give you a highlight of what I'll be touching on, first, I'll be talking about rethink. So rethinking what is a problem and why it is a problem. And then I'll move on to reskill. So what can we learn from other areas and industries in terms of reskilling today's creatives, as well as reboot. So trying to draw some connections back to resilience and sort of setting a future direction of what next. So rethink, what's a problem and why is it a problem? Now, I'm going to also draw a bit upon Doris Ruth Acuff's studies on how the cultural economy operates, as well as on inclusion and workforce diversity. But the ultimate problem within the cultural economy in today's climate is that how it operates has always been inherently exclusionary. And so the first reason of why that is, you know, concerns us as an individual or what we're born as. So we have a very standard idea of talent in the arts, particularly in the West. So talent should be Eurocentric, should be male, should be white, middle class, and non-disabled. So this very much, fits into the traditional criteria of what we determine to be privilege in modern society. And so obviously we see this echoed in a lot of statistics as well, and particularly in a report done by the Creative Industries Foundation. The performing arts industry in the UK comprises of only 6% of BME participants. So this ultimately begins to create the snowball effect, because this influences recruitment decisions as well. The people who are already in the industry fit within this criteria, and in turn, they're only hiring people who fit within this criteria again. And so this creates a snowball effect, and this sort of never-ending loop. And the frustrating thing is that what you're born into, what you're born as, isn't something that you can change. So that's one of these sort of exclusionary work practices that we see today. And the second reason concerns, the industry on a whole, namely its business models of the cultural economy. And so normally the production methods within the cultural economy are all very project-based. So if you're a film composer, you're working on individual films. If you're a musician, you're playing at different venues every night. And if you're a painter, you're working based on individual commissions. So this is very much based off of a gig economy, which in itself isn't sustainable because of its unpredictability. So keeping in mind that most of the sector, 58% in fact, so 58% of the performing arts sector is self-employed compared to the national average of 13% in the UK. So what we see is a lot of people who participate or who work in the creative sector are all self-employed, and they don't have, the luxuries of having the stability that, you have working with a company. You don't have the same benefits. And so because it's hard for you to find jobs, then there's also a huge reliance on having networks to rely on, to get gigs and projects. Because again, if you're not sort of working for a company, you don't get a consistent stream of jobs coming your way. There's no consistent income. So then you're particularly reliant on those networks. So what does this mean? This means that you need to be flexible in terms of your time commitments, of your energy, of your other commitments in your daily life. But mostly this means that you need to have fallbacks in case you don't get a gig or a gig doesn't come through. And that relies on having a safety net that you've been born into, so such as family wealth or social status. Now, why is this a problem? So as a whole, as an industry, these exclusionary practices mean that we have a lack of workforce diversity. So particularly in this industry, where creativity and innovation is prized and it's what's been transacted with, diversity of thought matters more than ever. And you can't have diversity of thought if everyone has come from the same background and they all have the same experiences. Now, on an individual level, in terms of creators, a practicing career in the arts isn't seen to be, financially viable or stable if you don't fit into the right criteria. And I'm going to draw onto Bourdieu's concept of social capital here, which we know is a form of power that's derived from, an individual's class position or status. Basically, you need to have a certain level of social capital before you can comfortably participate in the creative industry. And undoubtedly, not everyone's going to be born having the same amount of social capital. And so the big question now is, how do we get more social capital? So how do we get more social capital? Now, that's a very good question, and it's a very complicated question as well, because it's not as simple as, you're going down to the grocery store and being like, yes, I'd like a bottle of social capital, please. And I've also said that it's something you're usually born with. So how can we get more? So to this, I'm going to turn to a very familiar example of sort of an advancer of social class, as an enabler to acquire more social capital, and that's through education. So I, for one, am a huge believer of the transformative power of education, and which sounds cheesy, I know, but I'm going to use an education lens to have a look at the cultural economy. So let's all take a step back and have a look at what's been happening there, before people enter the creative workforce. So what about arts education? Now, we can see that, those within the sector are trying to help rectify this issue of lack of diversity. We've seen some important initiatives. So from arts organizations, for example, we've seen learning and participation programs, as well as access and outreach programs in the form of masterclasses, for example, or behind the scenes videos of their various productions. Educational institutions have also done the same. So this is such as, conservatoires or universities. We've seen more sort of scholarships tailored towards BME students, as well as the implementation of foundation years for those who may have that educational gap. But there's still that sort of gap between exposing people to the arts as opposed to having people actively participate and become sort of creators within these industries. So why does that gap still exist? And again, I'm going to draw back to what I mentioned previously about a practicing career in the arts not being seen as financially viable and stable. So these new initiatives, they promote sort of more passive participation. So if you're watching a video or doing a masterclass, for example, you're doing that passively. Whereas I think the key is that switch between passive consumption and active participation within the industry. So what I think is that, while these access and outreach initiatives, they're great for the industry, it's great to get more people exposed and involved in the arts, but they're more focused on getting people into the arts and not concerned about what happens after. So what happens after people have been exposed? And to demonstrate this, I'm going to reference a study done by Roberta Communion, and she is a lecturer at KCL. And this particular study focuses on exploring early career trajectories for young musicians who have just graduated. And so one of the main points within that study was that all of her research subjects stated that they had difficulty translating their study into their degree. Now, I'm going to also draw upon this one example by this anonymized subject named Mark. And Mark says that there was very little in my degree whereby I could say, well, I've learned that. How can I apply that to the real world? I think it's very much I'm learning about music and I'm in my own little music bubble. And then suddenly you leave university and you find there isn't a job for a music graduate. You need to find what your strength is and what the jobs available are, because I didn't have a clue really of what I could do with my degree. Now, what does that say about how arts education is being executed or what is being taught in the arts at the current moment? The big point here is that current arts education exacerbates the issue of job precarity in the arts because it neglects the sort of professional aspect to being a creative and only focuses on developing practical skills. So if you're a musician, for example, what you learn mainly is, for example, how you shape your embouchure so they can make a better tone on your instrument. Or if you're an artist, then it's about, what kind of sketching techniques could you do to shade in the circle. But there's far more to being sort of a creative freelancing professional than just being practically proficient in your craft. And so I'm just going to dial back and recap what I've mentioned in this sort of section, which is that A, the cultural economy is exclusionary through its business models and hiring practices. And arts education, which we can see has a potential to become an enabler or provider of social capital, doesn't help to mitigate these exclusionary practices in its current state. So I've talked a lot about problems. So now I want to have a look at some potential solutions, and particularly within education. So if I go back to Eckhoff's study, she also mentions this concept of transforming interventions. She mentions that there's a need for these transforming interventions which change industry practice. So we should include more paid internships, for example, or our recruitment practices should be more inclusive. But I'm going to just dial it back a little and scale it down a bit, because while I realize that changing industry practice would be the ultimate dream, I think it's a more logical next step to change the people who are going into the workplace, before they go into it. So when I think back to sort of my second year, third year of university for my undergraduate, and I was talking to my friends about, what we're going to do after university, most of our conversations usually evolved around this, which, we can see is kind of a good representation of how the arts are perceived in terms of job stability. What you can do with a music degree, you can teach, you can perform, you can compose, but most likely you will die in poverty. Now, obviously, this is meant to be a bit funny, but at the same time, I think it's a good reflection of how, especially the younger generation who are going into the job market, view sort of the job stability or the viability of a career in the arts. Now, I'm also going to shift your attention to another type of figure. So this is a chart from HESA in the UK. So HESA stands for Higher Education Statistics Agency, and this shows some statistics on ethnicity makeup per university subject in 2018 to 2019, based on UK domiciled students. And so I'm going to just sort of preface this, that this chart focuses on ethnicity alone. And it obviously neglects a lot of the context surrounding participation in these university subjects. Not all white people are rich, for example. But I think what we can still see is we can see some trends begin to evolve. And so I've tried to simplify that chart a little bit. And we can see that I've had this division on the left and on the right. So on the left are the more traditionally perceived to be vocational subjects. So these are the subjects with the most BME participation. So medicine, dentistry, law, computer science. Whereas with history and creative arts, we see much lesser amounts of BME participation. So students within these so-called vocational subjects, in fact, have been introduced to the concept of job hunting in a much more straightforward and structured way. And I remember talking to my friends who were studying law and sciences, again, back in my undergrad days. And I was talking to a lawyer friend, and she's just like, oh, no, I need to apply for all these vacation schemes. I need to get my training contract secured. And this was only second year, by the way. So she pretty much had her entire career just laid out for her within the second year of her undergraduate degree. And this was similar with my friend who also did sciences and wanted to get into the tech industry. And so I was asking her, oh, how are you finding jobs? Who are you reaching out to? And she was just listing out all of these different, graduate schemes that she could apply to. And how she was really able to take advantage of LinkedIn networking and to reach out to recruiters. And I think particularly this focus on LinkedIn has been interesting because we've actually seen a trend, or I have anyway, especially on my LinkedIn feed, about the rise of the LinkedIn influencer. So this is usually a person who comes from a tech field, and they've really risen to popularity, especially I think during the coronavirus, because they've been teaching people how to network and how to tailor their CVs, how to form the cover letters, who to network with, how to network, how to reach out to recruiters. And so I think that sort of this rise of their popularity is testament to the idea that students need this process of job hunting to be broken down. Now, it's obvious that it's a lot more straightforward in industries such as law or the sciences because you have sort of strict structures. You have companies that you can apply for, you have recruiters to reach out to, whereas in the creative industries, this isn't quite so straightforward. And so there's an added difficulty for modern day creatives because they not only have to be proficient in their area of the arts, but they also need to be good business people and to represent themselves accurately. So in terms of how to market themselves, how to pitch, and how to network, these are all skills that they now have to learn. So if we go back to Eckhoff's sort of transforming interventions, I'm going to add in one more of my own point, which is that we need to build transparency on the practical aspects of being a creative professional. Now, I think there's also been kind of a taboo when we're talking about money in relationship to the arts, because money always seems to be dirty. It's something that tarnishes, the purity and sanctity of the artwork and, by extension, the artistic industries. But I think we need to realize that ultimately, we are living in quite a money-driven society. So we need to build transparency about the more practical or the money-making side to being an artist. Because in today's climate, in order to sort of set yourself apart and excel, there's a lot more competition, and you can't just be sort of good at your craft anymore. So you also need to be a good business person. So how would we integrate this into education, like law or tech? And so I'm going to draw upon yet another conversation with another friend I have, and she's currently studying film composition as a postgraduate course in the UK. And so the interesting thing with film composition or film music is that it always seems to be a little more commercialized form of music. So money is always at the forefront of the filmmaking industry. So with budgets and targets, for example. And for musicians, it seems to be more of a business than it is than just, if you were to become a freelance musician. So within this course, she learned a lot of, very important things about orchestration, about how to use certain software, which are, all very good and very valid in terms of, being a good film composer. But I think there's a particularly interesting module that she brought up that's not quite common in typical conservatoire university education, particularly within the arts. And so this module was called Music Business. And what it taught people was that it taught them how to manage rights, for example, for the music if they were to license it, how to network, how to approach music supervisors, and how to do a good pitch. So ultimately, this was a module that focused more on the business aspect of becoming a film composer rather than just focusing, on the essentials such as learning how to compose and orchestrate and use software. So this also sort of took into account the business person aspect to being a modern day creative professional. And so I asked her, I was like, okay, this is quite different from, what you normally do or expect within a composition degree. And how are you finding it? And do you think it's useful? And she said that it really helped her sort of formulate this idea of what life as a film composer would be like post-university or post-degree. And it really helped her to develop essential skills as a freelance professional. And so number one, it helped her develop a good awareness of the industry. So because, they brought in various lecturers who were all leaders in the field and kind of, gave this good idea of what others in the industry or professionals in the industry were doing to help them to help market themselves and to help them become more profitable. And so she, in reflection, was able to look at what others were doing, and that gave her a good sense of awareness for herself as to what she had to do to get to that level. But more importantly, it also gave her a sort of good sort of starting ground as to building this career, because this particular module gave her the opportunity to learn how to pitch, to learn how to market herself. And she really sort of, because she had the chance to practice all of this, it gave her the confidence that she could in fact pursue this as a future career. And that in turn sort of increased her sort of the sense of job stability or viability as a film composer, is because that she had all these opportunities to practice being a professional film composer, which sort of helped ease that transition from education into sort of being a professional film composer. So my argument is that ultimately this particular module is only an example, but I think that this module needs to be implemented at earlier stages within an arts education. So keep in mind that this was only introduced as in a postgraduate course, which in itself could be seen as inaccessible or a luxury to lots of people. And so, as we've seen with other subjects such as law and medicine, the concept of finding jobs is very prominent and is hammered in early on within a student's sort of career. And so there's no reason, I think, that this separation of completing an arts education and becoming sort of a professional in the arts should still exist. And we need sort of an education, a careers education such like this, to bridge that gap between being an arts student versus being an arts professional. And so my ultimate argument, therefore, or my solution to this issue, is that we need to implement a career-based education at an earlier stage within educational institutions so that we can ensure that those who need it most will be able to benefit. So how do we take this all forwards? We need to start thinking about how we can reskill today's creatives. We need to realize that money is a prevalent issue now. And so I've gone on and on about job precarity, lack of diversity in the workforce, and using institutionalized education in the arts as a potential solution. So what I want to do now is I want to relate this all back to today's conference theme of resilience. How does it all connect? So when we're thinking about resilience in the CCI, we are thinking about how creativity is the greatest currency, which is used in the CCI. So this is born from human thought, expression, and individuality. Sorry, my throat's gone all weird. Oh dear. But so the creative industries thrive because they essentially act as megaphones for individuals whose voices will not necessarily be heard normally. And so by increasing representation in terms of diversity within the CCI, this increases the ability, its ability to become more relevant to all types of people, whether they've chosen to actively participate in it or not, which leads to increased amount of engagement and in turn benefiting the CCI economically by helping them to become more resilient. And so just to round this whole presentation off, because I'm aware of the time, I'm going to reuse the phrase rethink, reskill, reboot in a more beneficial way. And I'm going to reuse these three words as an equation that ties in with this theme of resilience. So ultimately, what we need to do, we need to rethink what we constitute to be a part of an institutionalized education in the arts, to reskill our upcoming young creatives with skills that are directly applicable to the industries that they want to go into, and to ultimately reboot the creative and cultural industries so that they become more representative in terms of the thoughts and characteristics of the people who choose to participate in them. And that, in my opinion, is one of many ways of how we're going to help make our cultural industries more resilient, physically, economically, and creatively. With that, thank you very much for listening to my presentation today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. And if not, please also feel free to email me or connect with me on LinkedIn. And so, Andrea or Augustina, I'm not sure, I can't see if there are any questions, but if there are, please let me know.
We seem to have a question that just arrived in, and it would be, so the first comment is that it's a very contemporary approach to arts education. What would you, so Anastasia wants to know, what would you suggest to revolutionize arts education to become a career-based education? How would you begin? Maybe cultural policy?
That's a very good question. Thank you, Anastasia. I think, well, obviously we can start small and build on from educational institutions, as I've mentioned, because this is sort of the path that's most regimented and most structured. You know, when you go into university, you have these a set syllabi, basically, of what's being taught. So we can start from there. But I think ultimately the dream would be to change industry practice. And to see this, you know, we'd ideally want more sort of structure in terms of paths for young creators who have just graduated. So as Ekoff mentions, you know, paid internships would be very good. Something sort of like apprentice schemes for people who have gone through the appropriate training beforehand, having more networks, or to some extent, you know, the LinkedIn of the arts and cultural industries, I think would be also very beneficial. I think ultimately it just needs to be more structured so that the path between education and career is more sort of clearly defined, like, you know, in law or in the sciences. And I think with that, you know, we can give people the confidence that if they do choose to do an education in the arts, that they are going to be able to find a job, you know, post-graduation. So I think this comes, you know, under the realm of cultural policy, educational policy, all of that. So it's a very broad topic, which kind of encapsulates both areas.
Thank you. Thank you for that. While we wait, there's somebody who's trying to write a question for you in the chat. Yolanda, we're waiting for your question. It seems like, for example, Hamza said that he's not sure if this is a bliss or not, but self-presentation in online platforms become an important skill for artists to acquire.
Absolutely, I think so. I think it's just been a skill for everyone, really, because presenting online is so different. And I can say this now that I've just presented to all of you. But particularly with artists, because, you know, with artists, we're used to dealing with connections, close networks, and the sort of people-to-people interaction, whereas we don't get that anymore. So how we come off on camera versus how we come off in real life can be very different as well. So I do agree, Hamza, that this is a skill that artists need to particularly work on, just presentation skills, not just in person, but particularly online as well. And I think with the move of everything, you know, going online, particularly during COVID, we're going to see a lot more international collaborations. And so again, this skill becomes particularly important. Yeah.
Just really quickly on the last question that arrived from Kat.
Okay.
She said that she has always seen the marketing campaign that you presented at the beginning as a message to expand the concept of arts and culture versus moving from the arts. I think this still would fall into your arguments for the 3 Rs you presented.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder your thoughts on this positioning, expanding arts to include digital versus leaving.
That's a very good question. And that actually corresponds directly with my research interests into art tech and ed tech. I think that we definitely are sort of seeing this increase in the interest between art tech and ed tech, you know, how we can use both together. We see a lot of, you know, AR, VR being used in museums, for example. We'll be seeing more digital initiatives, digital engagement initiatives implemented. I think it's just that I wanted to use this infographic to highlight the difference between arts and tech, particularly just because, you know, of the context of the infographic. Which was because it was a recruitment ad for sort of a tech-based campaign wanting to recruit people to get into tech, which is why I wanted to highlight this separation, or I think this infographic highlights this separation. But I do agree that art tech, ed tech is going to be, well, is becoming a very sort of new and up and coming aspect within the arts that we definitely should keep an eye out for. So I do agree that there are potential opportunities of how we can see art and tech working together to create new art, for example.
Sounds amazing. Thank you very much for sharing all this information.